Thank you so much, Professor, for that introduction. That was really too generous, in my opinion, but I'll take it anyways. And so I appreciate that. This is my second time being here at this university, so I'm glad to be back after nearly about 3 years. And it's also my first time presenting publicly in person since the pandemic began. So it's also a little bit exciting just because of that. So we're here today to talk about AI ethics and the problems with bias in AI. And I'm guessing a lot of you are probably familiar with some of these topics. And I might be preaching to the choir at this point, but nevertheless, I feel like it's something that we should still talk about. Now, there's sort of like this popular conception that based on the biases that we have within AI, the harms that are being reproduced, we could somehow develop an ethical framework or some human rights framework or some other procedure or tool to help us sort of overcome these issues. And I kind of question that. So the short answer to my talk is probably no. And we could probably end the talk right now, but that wouldn't be fair. So I'll try to maybe give a little bit of background to how I'm thinking about this and how I've come to my conclusions. I wouldn't say that I have all of the answers, and I wouldn't say that the answers I have are even the best answers, nevertheless. But I still think they might give us something to sort of provoke our thinking, and maybe we might reach certain conclusions. If I could just maybe lay open the problem space even some more. I'm sure we're familiar with many of the biases within artificial intelligence, especially so within the criminal justice system. You may have heard of how potential criminals are being sentenced using predictive systems, so they can determine who should go to jail or how long they should stay there. And largely this has been also shown to be biased. And a lot of work has been done by amazing researchers who have shown that to be true. Even when it comes to hiring employment. So if you're a woman, for example, and you want to work in computer science, and then you submit a resume, and then they scan your name, and your name appears to be a typical woman's name, it's been shown that as well some AI systems can sort of negatively score that. And then your chances of getting an interview become even less likely. There are many examples within computer vision how these systems cannot detect darker skin tones. So if you're like somebody like me or lighter or a little bit darker, some of the systems cannot quite accurately detect you. And a few years ago, there was a famous incident, I believe, with Google search. So somebody was searching an image of it was a young black man and young black woman. And then Google was labeling the image as like gorillas, something like deeply offensive. And so there was an uproar about that, and then they eventually were able to fix that. But AI is used pretty much in almost every aspect of our lives within the social welfare system. We now have children being removed from their families simply because an AI system thought it might be the right idea. And these have shown to be biased as well. And this, of course, happens as well within healthcare. I mean, the examples are just many. The legal system. And so, if we were to spend the entire time talking about these biases, we could essentially talk the entire time and not really cover much else. But one of the problematic ideologies here is that we have sort of come to think or understand that AI technology is neutral, right? That it's probably doing the correct thing. It's doing the mathematical, the logical thing. And that's something that I will sort of be trying to push back on during the talk, as we continue this talk. So let's say that AI technology really is neutral, right? Maybe it does truly do the right thing. If you've taken, I'm not sure, are there any computer science majors here? Okay, one. Have you taken an AI course yet?
No, not yet.
Not yet, okay. I'm not sure if this is what's still in the curriculum, but there used to be this famous book by a Berkeley professor. It's like the foundational book in AI. And within the early chapters, he begins to make this statement that AI does the rational thing, it does the correct thing, right? It does the right thing. Okay, so when we're seeing these biases, in light of that AI is doing the right thing, so like how do we explain this gap? You know, are these people truly more criminal than others? Are these parents truly worse parents than, say, parents who are from a different ethnicity? Or is there something really happening there such that there's this discrepancy between the actual outcomes and AI supposedly doing sort of the right thing? And so if there is this gap, how far does this gap go? Was artificial intelligence always doomed to reproduce the harms that are already existing within society? Or was this like a mistake, something in the implementation, something went wrong? Or is it something really, really fundamental, something very foundational? In other words, what are the root causes of the harms reproduced by artificial intelligence on those groups which have been historically marginalized? And why aren't the benefits and the risks of AI proportionally shared amongst everybody? Why is it some groups seem to bear most of the risk of AI? They bear most of the harms of AI, but then certain groups bear most of the benefits of AI. How does that even come together? And if you read the typical literature, there's various ideas and answers to this. Some suggest that maybe it's technological, right? Maybe if we have better data sets, let's just collect more data. With more data, we can have better conclusions, better outcomes, better solutions. Or maybe it's the algorithms themselves. Maybe we need to create better models or bigger models, bigger language models. In the past years, we've had sort of what people now call foundational models. These are like very large natural language models that have been trained over billions and billions and billions of pages on the internet. And so you might have heard of like GPT-2 or GPT-3, and the list goes on and on and on. So is that a solution? Do we train more, or do we break these models apart? Do we make them open source the way other people can look at how they were trained and maybe try to reduce the bias in that? Maybe it's procedural. Maybe just hire people like myself who will just add the diversity factor, right? Just by being there. It's like it's interesting because sometimes when you're in these rooms, just by being there, it's like you double the diversity factor. So like, for example, if there's another black person, I just double that by 100%. So, but kind of kidding, but also not really. So do we bring like more diversity, more women, more non-males, more ethnicities to try to solve the problem? Or maybe we have these ethics boards. I don't know if you all have seen like in the past few years, different companies, Microsoft, Google's have like these ethic boards. Facebook has one, TikTok has one, and even there was an incident recently in the past year, I believe, where a prominent black woman researcher at Google got into some trouble for having. She was hired to be an ethical researcher on the AI team, and she raised ethical obligations to what Google was doing. And then in turn, they allegedly let her go because of those obligations. So why is she there even in the first place? And so if it's procedural, does that actually work? Or do we need to even look different and try to see how we can sort of fix those problems? I'm also part of an ethical AI board at a tech company. So I'm also sharing from like an insider as well. But I wouldn't say some of these boards actually work that well because most of these boards don't have any legal power. We cannot force a company to say, don't build that technology because we ethically don't believe it's the right thing to do. We don't have that authority. And so the most authority that they give us is they say, well, if we do something you guys don't agree with, just go make a big fuss about it publicly, and then we'll somehow be motivated to maybe change. But is that an effective solution? So just complain about it, and then having people been complaining for decades around these issues. And then of course, universities now have this responsible CS curriculum where you bring the philosophy department and the computer science department and sociology and anthropology, and then they sort of come together, and then you say, hey, let's all work together to try to understand sort of these implications of this technology that we're building. But is that enough? I mean, certainly it's being done, and there's a lot of money going to funding this stuff. But is that all there is to really bring about this change? I kind of don't think so. And I'll talk more about why in the academic context, I think it's hard to actually bring about that change. What I ultimately believe is that there are certain myths about AI. What we believe about its foundation, its purpose, what it can do, the promises about its benefits and how it was created, and this ultimately they lead us to sort of it's like they doom us from the start, and that like we will always reach a bad outcome because of these myths that are not even true, but they're useful to sell AI, right? They're useful to get this technology to be widely adopted. They're useful to justify how power and resources should be distributed within a society. I used to also work doing building recommendation systems for an AI company, and it's quite interesting, how we would sell this technology, and it's a pretty common thing in many tech companies to promise, that AI is doing something quite amazing, when really the reality is not so quite true. So I would like to sort of maybe go back in history and try to really understand what are these foundations that it gave us sort of this world where we have AI reproducing harms in society, when the original thought was that AI would actually be a positive benefit to society. We can go back as early to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle and other ancient Greek philosophers believed that the world was rational, right? That it was organized, that it was orderly, and that we could use sort of the rational mind to try to make sense of, of the world, and maybe discover rules of logic that we can use to determine statements of truth. And then with the statements of truth, we can build more statements of truth and just make more sense of the world. Aristotle even went forward to say that man was a rational animal. It's our rational minds that actually make us different from animals. We're able to conceive ideas and make sense of them at a greater capacity than animals. And it is through the rational mind that humans can essentially discern from right and wrong. We can decide what is correct, what is moral, what is true, what is a true statement, and what is not a true statement. And in addition to these ideas, they didn't just stay with Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. We find that this line of thinking, this trend of thought, also then continued as well into the other European philosophers. Sir Francis Bacon, who was sort of seen as the father of the scientific method, he has these statements about the nature of the rational mind. And in one of the examples, he says that there's really nothing that separates a king from a peasant. A peasant can use their mind in a rational way to the point that they can eventually have more wealth than a king. And so really the mind can do anything. And so he came up with this concept of having mastery over nature. We can use our minds to master nature. But not just nature as in like the physical world, but we can also master markets. So we can master the economy, make it more optimized, make it more efficient. Simply by using this rational mind, we can sort of have these optimizations. And so this idea sort of then continued, and I'd like to kind of emphasize that in my viewpoint, this is really the beginning of artificial intelligence. This is the foundation of artificial intelligence. If we go beyond the mathematics, go beyond the technical, it's this idea that we can observe the world objectively, formalize those objections, and then eventually we can automate those objections, right? This is where it's starting from, because we are rational, and so the world is rational. We can use our rational minds to objectively see the world. And then if we're able to sort of objectively see the world, we can write laws and formalize them and be able to act upon them. We find the same idea as well with Leibniz, who also built the same thing So Leibniz, one of the most famous mathematicians, of course, he also believed in this idea of the rational mind, and he believed that we could have this mathematical algebra that could describe any concept. So think of a tree or a person, or they would have like a specific symbol that they could use to describe that. So for example, let's say we're trying to represent a man or a male, right? So we'd say that's the number one. Then a woman is the number two, and 1 + 2 is 3, which would be a child. Something like that. We can actually make computations using this language. And again, his idea was that eventually, once there's an algebra determined, we can then plug this into a machine, which would then compute and give us truthful statements. So eventually, you can answer questions like, who should win the presidential election? You just put their name here, and then put the other person's name, and then the machine sort of computes. And really, this is sort of, again, another precursor of artificial intelligence. We're essentially doing the same thing with a different mathematical language today, but we're still trying to reach the same conclusion. So if we're going to look at the biases of AI, or some of these, the harms that are being reproduced, it's probably worthwhile to really understand these foundations. Were they wrong to begin with? Do they actually lead to negative outcomes? Do they actually lead to bad outcomes? And if we look at history, the answer is probably quite clear. Most of the times when these ideas were being pushed, right, it was essentially ideas that fell in line with how Western European thinkers thought. So it was used to justify how they saw the world, how they view the world. How do you even measure rationality in the first place? Like, how do you say that this is actually rational, right? And so that's how they view the world. And so they made it, sort of the system to support how they view the world. And so this is the same system, the same type of thinking, the underlying philosophy that supports colonization, slavery, the harmful effects of capitalism, and the list goes on and on and on. So it's almost not surprising that we would sort of have negative effects within AI if they share the same sort of like philosophical or the same guiding philosophy that has led to these other inhumane institutions that have affected society. Once we see that, I think then that's when we can sort of try to even, sort of make a difference and shape the actual outcome of the tools that we build. This idea that a person is just simply rational, it's really outdated, number one, but it shapes really how we think about computers. One of the most wide known definitions of AI, and there isn't really truly universal definition, but one that is accepted is that artificial intelligence is essentially trying to replicate human abilities or human thinking or human behavior, right? If you apply the Turing test, it's when you can have a computer become so intelligent that someone on the other end cannot tell that it's a computer. So it's able to mimic being human. Well, you need to first answer what does it mean to be human in the first place, right? If you're going to base a machine off of being human, well, what does being human actually mean, right? And so if we take the idea that humans are just rational, they can objectively see the world, it sort of leads to the idea that, well, machines can also do the same thing, right? Because machines can also use rationality and logic. And then we get into a situation where we now have to believe that AI is somehow neutral because we think that it's doing the rational and the correct thing. However, if we move away from that foundational sort of principle, that philosophy, that our rationality is sort of this essence of the world, the essence of who we are, how we relate to the world, and find other alternatives, we might be able to come to different conclusions. So I keep alluding to we might be able to come to different conclusions and so forth. So let me try to get to, okay, what's one actual way to come to such a good conclusion? What if we envision a human being as not just rational, but relational? Meaning that it's not just our ability to think that makes us human, it's how we relate to others that makes us human. That we need the context that others can provide. That's what really makes us human. That's what makes us feel like we're human beings. And what if that idea or definition shaped how we think about AI? So maybe we wouldn't be easily misled to thinking that, well, if I just build something in my room and apply it across the world, it's going to work well. because if it's rational, it must be universal, right? But then if I knew like, well, rationality isn't the end all, there's also this aspect of relationality. And so that I need context from others in order to build any type of system, whether we're hiring people to sort of build these systems, whether we're testing the effects of these systems. It's not enough to just be rational, but we can have this relationality. And the issue is that we normally don't find this in our curriculum. If you take a typical ethics AI course or conference or workshop, when we talk about ethics in AI, we're usually talking about Western philosophy, Western ethics. Right? We'll never say, well, this is what Shintoism thinks how we can sort of like view the world. This is how Confucianism would look at the world. Or even in my case, I study ubuntu philosophy from the African continent. It's rarely that we say, well, what does African philosophy have to say about what it means to be a person and how we can actually build AI? Something quite interesting is that Ubuntu itself literally means how to be a person. So it's like literally in the name, how we can become persons. So the irony is that the irony within like the ethics and AI conversation is that we're also reproducing the things that we're critiquing. We're saying we need more diversity, we need to have more power given to other people, but then the philosophy frameworks that we're using themselves are exclusive of those people whom we're saying they should be also part of the conversation. So it almost seems like even from the start, the project seems to be kind of like half failed already because it's already reproducing those biases within the first place. And until we have like such wider efforts of inclusion within the ethics, within how we think about technology, we're going to sort of reproduce those different harms. I mentioned a little bit about Leibniz and some of those mathematicians, but really the list is quite long. There's a sustained thread of this type of thinking, from John Hobbes, who inspired Leibniz, who also came up with this idea that thinking is just computational, right? It's like literally doing mathematics, right? And so if thinking is mathematical, a computer can do mathematics, so a computer can also do what humans can. So we find this idea sustained by the philosophers, sustained by the mathematicians, the logicians. Alan Turing said something similar as well in his famous 1950 paper, where he talked about really AI is just like educating a child to the human brain. So with enough training and with enough assistance, a computer can eventually reach the level or similar level to the human brain. So this idea is deeply based on this idea of this rational mind and so forth, but it doesn't actually quite apply. So ethics in AI doesn't work necessarily. We need to develop that. We need to improve it. And I don't think also changing the procedures to including people who are more diverse actually does much as well. It doesn't help to be in a room or in a table without any power to exercise, right? Being there symbolically is not enough to actually achieve any actual outcomes. What we need to do is to really question really this role of power and wealth within society. I don't think AI is sort of separated from society itself. One way in which I think we sort of muddy the waters here is we sort of say there's something wrong about AI or there's something wrong about the internet. But really, there's something wrong with how we use the internet, something wrong with how we relate to AI, how we think about AI, how we apply it. That's where the problem is. And so we often then sort of like remove the burden of responsibility from ourselves and we apply it to, well, let's just investigate that issue that's over there. When really we should also be looking at how we relate to AI. And the philosophy that has like these ideas of relationality can help us to think more about how do we relate to AI, how do we shape AI, and how does AI in turn affect us, and how does it shape society. But if we're always sort of concentrated on this these other frameworks, or whether it's the human rights frameworks or whatever, where the still fundamental underlying idea is this idea of the rational individual and so forth. We may miss a whole set of solutions that can actually help us to really understand the issues with AI today and how we can fix them. And I'd like to say that I don't think this is a problem that's unique to AI today. In every period we've had different institutions that justify how power and wealth should be distributed. First, it was different religious institutions. Maybe the God said this group of people should have all of the wealth and the power, or maybe God, chose a certain group to, to be the chosen race, right? To go and Christianize everybody else. It's how colonization and slavery were sometimes justified, right? God told us to go colonize these people and to Christianize them. That way they can, sort of, be saved or whatever the case is. However, it's still a way to sort of justify how power and wealth are to be distributed within society. After that, the philosophers in the Enlightenment era say the same thing as well. Oh, Asians are not as rational as Europeans, Africans are not rational, so let's go rationalize them and teach them how to be logical, right? And then again, that also justifies how should power and wealth be shared. After that, it was scientific racism, the craniology, eugenics, and the list goes on and on and on. And now AI is essentially playing the same role. Who should get a loan, right? Who should, get approved for a job? Who should, be arrested, or who should be sent home, right? It's still, in a way, playing the same role where it's justifying how power should be distributed. The point, I think, however, is that to really make any progress, we have to sort of shift from this fundamental view of AI and find other views that might be well fit and well adopted to actually address the problems that we have today with the kind of bias and how it's being produced. Okay, so I think I can just end it there and maybe take some questions.
Thank you. Do you want to take the questions yourself so I can take a look at the chat?
Sure, okay. Okay, there's a question.
Just like personally, what do you think AI might look like if it was geared towards more like a interpersonal view of humanity instead of like a rational one?
Okay. I think how we view AI would certainly change, and we would be more humble in our marketing about AI and how we think about AI and in the role that it can actually play within society. The issue now is just that, it's like so deeply embedded with the computing culture, right? The idea of like this, rugged individualism. I don't know if you've come across that term, that you could be a super coder and you can make a startup or an app or something, and that it's like you against the world, right? The same concept of like that Sir Francis Bacon came up with, mastery over nature. You can master nature. You can master the world using these universal laws. I think we'd be more humble and realize that we cannot have that it's actually impossible to have such a state of the world, and that we need to work with people and limit our use of AI. So maybe reduce how we use AI in situations where it could be quite sensitive, like within families, who can get a loan, or how we think about the legal system. So if anything, at the very least, it shapes how we can think about AI. And then once we change our thinking, then we're more likely to pass policy and legislation that reinforces how we're thinking. But if our thinking is that AI is, what I said before, then it's less likely that we can actually have legislation and policy to counter that.
Thank you.
Sorry.
What do you think about the idea of a more localized AI, that is one where the mechanism is operated and implemented and constructed based on the worldview of whatever culture or community that needs it, and then part two of that would be, given the very rich diversity, both ethnically, culturally, religiously in the United States, is that ever feasible? Because at a certain point, if it's so localized, you might as well just have a person doing it. So, also what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think, well, it can be so localized because that might be, I guess, one extreme end. The other extreme end is having these really, really, really large models that are built with everyone's data. And it's quite interesting because, we care so much about privacy and individual rights, but if data that is collected on a large group, which I'm not necessarily part of at that time, can actually shape what happens to me, then, where's my individuality, right? It's like I'm being sort of shaped by the masses. And so, there's like almost this contradiction, AI sort of came from like this individual, rationality idea, but then the actual effect of itself is that we're actually now encroaching upon individual rights themselves. So it's like, it's just like this like ironical outcome that we have. But I do think that different societies should have their own AI systems that are localized to them. Now somebody can say, well, what about the Chinese, how they use AI, and is it too invasive and so forth? Do I support that? No, I mean I wouldn't say I necessarily support the improper use of AI. I just support that different societies should have AI that they build according to their needs. And if the AI is problematic, then they will use their local measures of resolving conflicts to try to find a solution. But I think the idea that we can build tools in Silicon Valley and push them globally, and they'll just work fine without any issue, is really outdated and it should be challenged at every stage. But I want to sort of add to that comment, or to your question, and sort of suggest, share about how difficult that actually is. These companies, they have to make value for their shareholders. They have to globalize, right? It's how, when you're raising for a startup, right, you have to show this growth, this tremendous growth. And the bigger you grow, the bigger, value that your company has. So it's like they're incentivized to become like this. Whether they mean to do harm or not, it's like they're incentivized to become like that. And if it's not the companies themselves who want to grow, I've heard this argument so many times at the School of Government, where you have like people in government who go to the Kennedy School just to talk about AI and so forth. And they'll say, well, if we don't do it, China will do it. WeChat will take over Facebook, and we saw last year how that TikTok controversy with Trump, kind of played out. And so even if they don't want to necessarily do that, even if the tech companies try to limit themselves, there's a whole other group that thinks, well, it's still important for geopolitical power. We need to have our tech companies being the dominant tech companies in the world. So then how do you counter like these like very large forces, right? One, it's how we see technology in and of itself, how we dream about AI, and then how these tech companies also have to push their profits. And then this geopolitical factor as well, how governments also want to enforce and make sure that their companies are the trillion-dollar companies of the future. So it's kind of hard, but I still believe that eventually we have to come to a solution where we localize things. Will it happen? I don't know. I don't think capitalism and globalism have any way to localize anything. It's like it's supposed to be like this like global unified thing, and so it's almost like trying to fight against how we even think about the world, how the world even operates. I hope it's possible, but I'm a little skeptical.
Like as developers, how can we like write bias out of AI? How can we write bias out of algorithms?
I don't know. I think it would also require the help of other experts who study these issues of bias. So maybe sociologists, racial scholars, critical race theory, anthropology, and just a greater sense of awareness of bias. Typically when you work in the tech industry, you don't just, you typically have a product manager, right? And then you have maybe a team leader or a manager. Then you have like the engineers. If you're an engineer, you don't care about anything besides optimization and efficiency. How do you get the fastest code to execute and save the company money? You're not thinking about if this is deployed in India, what would actually happen, right? You're thinking about, what data structure can I use, right? And if you're an engineer, that stuff is exciting, right? You want to solve problems. But it's rarely that you have the opportunity to even go beyond that and think about the actual consequences of what you're building. And that doesn't happen often, and many companies can't afford to sort of do that because just based on the distribution of labor, it's like, okay, you do this, and you do that, and you do that. Then somebody in another department, maybe the legal department, will think about, okay, what are the harmful effects of what we're doing? But it's never those people having the same conversation. And so I think that's something that can change if developers are more involved in that process of not only building the tools, but looking at the actual outcome of those tools. But I don't think that happens, and I don't think it's gonna. I think it's really tough.
And then also, like, you talked about one of the solutions possibly being like making a huge database, like a huge, where you take in basically huge sums of data. Do you think that's closer to the answer, or do you think we need to like literally rebuild everything, kind of change how we think about persons as entities,
Yeah,
or like as, you know what I mean?
yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, there's an idea that the more data we have, the better, right? So like if there's racism, we'll get more data. If we're not hiring enough women, then let's just have more data. But having more data doesn't really change the fact that, you know, someone has to sort of, you know, when you're building AI, right, you're training a system. You need to have sort of a way to measure the results of the AI. Somebody has to prove that it works correctly. So we still bring our biases, even if the data does change. We decide, okay, is the result correct? Is the result good? So while we might maybe remove a little bit of the bias within the data, you know, we still bring other biases into the process itself. If it's not, you know, you deciding is this good enough, maybe there's other bias that relates to funding. So maybe you don't even get the venture capital to build your solution, which could be a better AI tool, because someone else has another bias doesn't think your company or your solution is actually worthwhile. So it's like there's sort of different types of biases that are encountered, and I don't think having more data can sort of like free us from those biases themselves. In fact, privacy experts, you know, they complain that, you know, this would actually make the world less private, right? So, you know, she can think of the typical examples, the Facebooks and Googles who collect so much information. So, should they collect more information than what they're already doing? Because if that's the solution to have less bias, then essentially then those companies are doing the right thing. So we have the right to sort of criticize them for that. But yeah, I just don't think that would necessarily give us less bias than the system. I say it first. Yes.
Could you expand on Ubuntu and how AI would operate under it?
Yeah. Do you know the Ubuntu open source operating system? Have you heard of it? Okay. So usually people think of Ubuntu as like this operating system, but it's an open source operating system. And the whole idea is that they took the concept from the Ubuntu word itself in South Africa, and they said, let's just build the operating system together as a group where everyone is equal to contribute and to share. It's sort of like this egalitarian idea. But the sort of, I'm going to like use a long way to describe Ubuntu, and I think it's probably the best introduction. One way to think about Ubuntu is kind of the lens of justice, right? What does justice actually mean? So even with the biases within AI, what would justice look like? And again, it turns out that there are different conceptions of what justice actually is. If we think about, say, after the Second World War, right? And so when they were now trying the Germans, and, you know, some of them were executed or hung, the Nuremberg trials and the Hague and so forth and so forth. That's almost using sort of like this Kantian idea of justice, sort of saying like an eye for an eye. You know, if you take your life, then your life sort of deserves to be taken as well in order to show the value of life, right? You know, you shouldn't be able to do something which you wouldn't allow someone else to do, you know, as well. And so if you take your life, then your life should be taken, right? And so this is a version of justice that many people say, yeah, that was fair. They got what was coming to them, and you know, and that was that, right? But then now let's look at another situation. This time it's in South Africa, right? So you have a white minority population, about like 7% of the population. They control the entire black population for hundreds of years, right? Every atrocity you can think of, it's happened. And now it's 1994, and the black people, after 400 years, now have a chance to vote democratically. And they're just choosing the first black president. Now they have the police, they got the army, they have the banks, they have everything. And so now what should they do to the European minority that was ruling them? Right? Should they then say, well, an eye for an eye, you guys did to us what you did, so we have to also repay you in the same manner. We have to punish you for the offenses that we have suffered. And so this was a big concern and fear that it would happen, and they would be, in a way, kind of justified using that same justice system. Right? Criminals should pay, you do the crime, you do the time. But instead, the Ubuntu philosophy is not really about sort of like creating criminals or like you do the time, you must do the crime, you must do the time. It's more about restoring harmony whenever harmony is broken. So it doesn't care so much who broke the harmony, but that harmony has been broken. So we have to restore that. We have to fix that. And so in their case, the African leaders believed that, well, during apartheid, which was during the time they were being colonized, during apartheid, the humanity of the Africans was destroyed. Um, and therefore they needed to have the humanity restored. However, at the same time, in order for you to oppress somebody else, you have to throw away your own humanity. So now the white population, many of them also had lost their humanity because they were participating in that process. And so Ubuntu was about sort of then, how do we restore both groups to a sense of being human again? Because to be a human being in Ubuntu, it's it's through relationality. A person is a person through other persons. It's how I treat you that makes me a human being. If I enrich your humanity, I also become more of a human being. But if I oppress you, I also become less of a human being. So like we're tied together in ways we can't separate. It's all connected, right? How we relate to each other is sort of like, it's like the foundational view in like African philosophy. We're all just interconnected. The world is interconnected. We're building AI, it's also interconnected, right? Everything we do is just tied in together. And so we're tied in together, and our humanity is so linked together that my actions literally affect you and me at the same time. And so now in 1994, using like this philosophy, then they say, well, we have to give this, we have to give a chance for reconciliation. And so they took a process that lasted maybe about 3 or 4 years, where they say to anybody, black or white, if you committed a crime during this time, you killed somebody, you stole some money, whatever the case is, you can get amnesty and everything is done. There's no being hung, there's no prison time, there's no whatever. You would get justice, and to them that was justice, right? Not sort of this payback, but sort of restoring this harmony because they're all connected. And so if we do to them what they did to us, we become less human, even though there might be the justice way in in sort of like some Western types of thinking. And so Ubuntu sort of drives from that. That's like really the essence of what Ubuntu is. But you derive other things like community, helping each other, sharing, empathy, and so forth. But really, it's just how it's examining what does it mean to be a person. And to be a person means to be a person to other person. It's almost like a rhythm. It's like that's what Ubuntu. That's what Ubuntu really is at the basic foundation. Yeah, I think you were.
So obviously power dynamics are really pervasive in all of tech and AI, the individual level, like who develops it, who builds it, to the global level, who disseminates it, things like that. What do you think is the most liberatory approach to tech? Is it more localized concepts like Ubuntu or Ujima, or is it a larger dissemination of those? What do you think that looks like to start?
I think it's more localized. I think Ubuntu can work beyond Africa's borders. So I think it can be applied even here as well. But I still think there must be an element of localization. There's a famous example by this, I think there's Batistas in Mexico. In their charter for like independence, they were saying one of their fundamental pillars was like a universe of many universes, right? So having like these multiple relationships existing at the same time. And Ubuntu also tries to speak towards that, right? People have this idea that once you say we're connected, we're socialist or communist, not that there's anything wrong with those ideas, but they believe that we can obviously use that. But that's not quite true. It's this idea of that you can have many worlds in one, right? I have to accommodate your humanity in order for me to feel human. So your world must exist. Your world has a place for me to be part of that. And so Ubuntu sort of thing gives us like this, and we find the same idea within indigenous. Some indigenous cultures who believe in this like shared relationality idea. So I think, yeah, Ubuntu can be applied further, but also I think there must be a way to localize. Because even within the African continent, Ubuntu is localized differently, right? So one example is with the genocide in Rwanda, right, with over 1 million people who were killed in like 4 months. So they also had like an Ubuntu restorative process. Except for them, many of the people did get amnesty, but some of them didn't get it. They did like some prison, September prison. But that's how they were able to interpret that version of Ubuntu to them for their particular context, what happened to them. And so I think other cultures can also find like the major points from indigenous cultures and then localize them to address their own local needs. Sorry, I think you were next.
Although like localization is a way to make AI more representative, do you think with localization that you face a problem of that mimicking kind of already the social fabric of the world, which is there are discrepancies between ethnicities and races, and you feel like that can set a precedent for AI, which like entrenches certain like localized groups as having more effective AI or less effective AI? As you mentioned before, you face a problem of funding in different localizations. Some people have more like more opportunities for funding and maybe better education in some places to create their AI. So although you see it as being one of the more representative ways to like take in people and a system that would kind of go along with them, do you think it has the opportunity to be or have many discrepancies?
I'm sorry, I kind of lost you there.
I know. I basically
Yeah.
with the localization of AI, do you feel like it can mimic the social constructs that exist
Oh,
now?
I see, yes.
So basically, are certain people's groups going to have less effective AI and therefore not as good, and will that entrench that along with already social kind of global effects we have of some people being more privileged and some people having
I
less
see.
privilege?
I haven't quite thought of that, to be honest. But I think it is possible certain groups would have eventually a better AI. I've been reading a book on like capitalism by this Harvard professor, and he talks about even within capitalism, there are different types of capitalism. Some models work less well, and some models work really well. And well is, of course, it depends on like what you mean by well. But in terms of like producing wealth, some models of capitalism produce a lot of wealth and some don't. And so he was saying in the book that it's based on governance, like how you govern that. So I would sort of maybe draw a comparison to that and say probably how each society would govern itself. They might have different types of AI or like different benefits or different whatever way we can use to measure the success of an AI system. They might have different benefits to that. Just like how our society is shaped today, we have bias within it. So I'm not saying like other societies are not biased, right? In the African continent, you might find tribalism is a thing, right? Sometimes you find like say in Egypt or Nigeria, you find like there's like a Muslim versus Christian conflict going on and so forth. So I wouldn't say that Africa has zero biases or other places. So even those biases within those cultures might also sort of appear within the AI. So they would also have to find a way to make sure that they don't reproduce some of those harms. But I think if they use the typical American way, the Western European way, they will reproduce those harms. So it's about finding other frames that are less likely, not all the way, but are less likely to reproduce.
Will there be like AI cultural clashes in a way if there are different amongst different?
I think if the AI jumps borders, right? So if you're building an AI, say in France and you use it in Germany, then there might be a clash there simply because it's going beyond its ethical border, if you can call it that. So if an AI is used within an ethical border, I think it would be fine for that society. But because ethical systems can conflict, right? And so if the AI is based off of an ethical idea, but then the society doesn't respect that idea, then you're sort of imposing an ethical view on another society, which I think would probably ultimately result in some type of culture conflict. course it gets preference, but I think there's somebody else will.
Well, it follows up a bit on Lay's question. So I'm not entirely sure what you're saying. Like, I think you're not saying that AI ethics can't fix AI. You're saying Ubuntu ethics could fix AI. And, you know, if we had better ethics of AI, one that's multicultural, diverse, broader, and decolonized, we could think better of ways to regulate and rethink what AI can do for you. But then your emphasis on the local level makes me think you think we're just doomed because AI just is the product of our ethical systems, and so long as we have this as a particular ethical system in the West or whatever, we'll just screw to have AI that will keep reproducing structural inequalities. And then that makes me think, well, so you want to say ethics, period, not ethics of AI, but a better ethics could fix AI, right? If we thought really differently about human nature and not just what AI can do for us. And I think you're also saying a better politics of AI could fix AI in some ways,
Yes,
right? If we
yes.
really thought about ownership over data and like control over the functioning and the creation and the dissemination of AI and so on, then we do also much better if we uncovered all the relations of power that operate in the background that AI currently works to perpetuate and so on.
Yes, I think you're right about that. I think sort of the difference there, right? It's not that AI ethics can help, right? But the idea, as you mentioned, is that not the way we're doing it can. But we need an ethical system that really questions power and how we share resources within society. And so, of course, this then will sort of like shape us to think about how we define or how we even have how we define our policies and the politicians who can maybe implement those policies or the legal systems that come to that. I think that the title is I think the title is can be sort of viewed in sort of different ways. There is a problem with AI ethics, the dominant framing of it. I truly do believe that, but at the same time, I think that even if we change to Ubuntu ethics, right? What is Ubuntu ethics without legislative power, right? So we can talk about these nice principles and say, okay, or even have human rights frameworks that are, it's why today we still struggle with human rights frameworks to actually force companies to build better AI because they just don't apply to it. There's no way we can enforce those to different companies. So it's almost like a voluntary thing. So it's almost in a way, and I think part of that is also like my own being disenfranchised, or like just not being satisfied with the answers that we currently have. Because even when we do say we do use Ubuntu AI, right? The benefits of AI is tied to power no matter what. So we can know the right thing to do, we can know how to do it, but it doesn't mean that society will actually adopt that. And I think that's where ethics AI fails, or maybe needs to do a better job in sort of exploring that we're only just giving potential solutions, but they don't mean quite, they don't mean much without having actual power to enforce those solutions, to actually implement those solutions. And I think so. We often then, at least in my case and the people that I've been around with, we give too much emphasis on like, well, let's have the right ethical framework. Right? Once we have that framework, then that will be something that we can then use to bring good outcomes. But there's usually less emphasis on the reality. And I didn't talk in this talk. I didn't share much about the actual the coloniality that actually represents this entire struggle. That's just one way to describe it. And now there are movements that are trying to decolonize AI. And if you really think about colonialism, that's really the perfect metaphor to use if we're thinking about ethics and AI. Is that what is the actual structure which we live in? We live in a world that has been shaped by sort of these colonial atrocities and these power structures that have been derived from the colonial past. And whether we acknowledge that or not, they're like the background to our everyday life. They shape how we view race, how we view society, who has power today and who can do so. And it doesn't mean we give too much emphasis to colonialism. It's just saying that it's a reality that still hasn't been largely addressed, and it'll always continue to influence influence even how we build AI. And if AI ethics doesn't talk about that, then I think, in my viewpoint, I don't think it's doing much because it has to also talk about that element. In fact, I go so far, and I might be radical in this part, but I find ethical systems that don't have an idea for reparations totally, almost, kind of useless. In the United States, reparations, you can't even say that word. It's like you're pretty much extreme. But if an ethical system has no place for reparations, no place for restoration, no place for reconciliation, and we live in a world that needs reconciliation, that needs restoration, a world that has been divided, right? There's so much harm. If your ethical system doesn't have anything of that, can it truly bring the changes that we need when we talk about AI? And I don't think so. So I know this is a long answer, but I do think ethical AI can work, but I think it also fails in some major ways. And I'm not saying this is a particular view as well, because there are many people who have done this research for much longer than I am, who would think, well, no, it's, that doesn't do with anything, we can find other ways that are more logical to solve. But this is just, what my research has led me to believe, that we need just different ethical systems that talk about power, directly talking about power, and that talk about these concepts, reparations, reconciliation, restoration, in order to have any type of change. I've lost track of who was next, but I think I saw you in the back, and then you.
I'm curious what you see as the role of large centralized governments in solving this problem through regulation.
Yes, so there has been a lot of legislation recently about regarding facial recognition technology by the police departments, and I think that's good, because the government can then sort of override what big tech is doing and say, you can use this technology in certain areas. And I think that's actually good. So I think there is a role for government to play, and government should be empowered to be able to make those decisions. So I'm glad that the activism being done this bill has actually resulted in some of those.
Do you think that's in contrast with your idea of like local influence as opposed to large centralized government?
Good question. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's in contrast with localized movements. I think the government and the local communities can work together. In some ways, a government, maybe you can have a localized government, right? Maybe that, a localized government that represents the needs of that local group. So I don't think necessarily there has to be like some antagonism or whatever the case is, but they can work together to meet the needs of the people that they actually represent. I'm not sure if that's it. I'm happy to talk after. So there was some, you were next. Yes.
My question is kind of twofold, in that I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by instilling Ubuntu values into AI systems on a practical, tangible level. Like, what would it look like for these big tech entities and other systems in our society that use AI to do that? And you had mentioned earlier that even if these tech companies themselves wish to limit their AI systems, they are at force or in opposition with larger forces like the government, who are more concerned with the geopolitics of it all. And so I guess my second question would be, even if we did try to implement these Ubuntu values or other non-Western values into AI systems, would it ever be possible for these big entities to do that when they are met with such forceful opposition, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not the most hopeful. That's not my answer. But so like some practical ways that we can instill Ubuntu values, which are also found in other cultures as well. So we can think of them as like broadly indigenous, but I don't say indigenous because we tend to have this idea that if it's indigenous, it's not really critical thinking, like robust thinking at all. But I think even the idea of having adequate representation, how we do it, right? And even if you're at the table, how do we distribute and share power within society? If we're building a solution, who is the human being whom we're building for, right? Ubuntu So which human are we actually building for? And what humans are being served with the tools that I think it gives also like just one framework of asking better questions during the process of building AI, a way to measure, okay, are we giving those people whom we're including enough power, right, enough say within the process itself, whether it's funding, whether it's leadership positions, right? Do they have leadership within the company to make such a decision? And also just on the welfare of society itself, because one is also kind of communal. So then what is the impact of this technology on society itself? Does it does it improve society? And again, of course, there's debate on that, because how do you measure a good impact on society and so forth? And I think that also kind of depends on the ethical framework that you're using. There's something like a good analysis might not be good analysis. So it's really how we build AI and how we think about it, how we relate to it, how we distribute power, and what is ultimate impact on the individuals and ultimate impact to society itself, and being able to sort of put people first before profits, which is kind of hard to do. Sort of like big tent, right? It's like often the environment and society seem to kind of go last, And so I think that's difficult. So just one quick addition. It's interesting because in other like say I think it's Colombia, no Peru, and in South Africa, the environment has a legal right to itself. So it's like a person, and I think that also comes from their ethical understanding that the environment is also influential in how we live as human beings. So we need to care for society and the environment and the individual and the community at the same time. And so even that type of thinking might also help us to think about the environmental effects that our tools have. But I'm not trying to romanticize, ubuntu and so forth. I just think that some of the values, which fund, frankly, many other societies, might be applied to help us think more about these issues. Because these societies have also thought about difficult questions over, thousands of years. So what have they learned that can help us as well think about it?
With the general monopoly that the global north has over the tech industry, and also just the lack of resource sharing and things that goes on, in the every man for themselves ideology that kind of exists in the tech industry as a whole, how likely do you think it is that we will see independent groups or startups, I guess, from the global south entering the market in a big way to kind of, or just generally more diverse ideology entering the tech market?
Yeah, it's kind of hard because big tech is really moving into the global south as much as is possible. Some of the internet infrastructure in the African continent was built by Facebook and Google. So they're literally controlling the backbones of the internet within the African continent. Most people, when they use the internet in, say, Zimbabwe or some other country, they think of Facebook as the internet because Facebook signs deals with the telecom companies and says, make our app free, we'll pay for the data costs. And the data costs are quite expensive in the developing nations. They're like 3 times the cost of the data here in the US. So, I wouldn't rule out the possibility for a global soft company to really emerge and to do quite well. It's just that the odds are just really high, and the obstacles are really quite high. But I think there are some local companies which I've also been working with that are trying to reproduce the Facebook model in the sense of that they will pay for the data costs and allow developers like me to put my app onto their platform. And so this sort of thing gives us a way to compete against free apps because now my app is free. But if we didn't have such a structure, it would be hard to convince people who are making maybe $1 per day to buy a bundle, 1 gigabyte bundle for $1. So what you need to choose, it's like a really difficult choice for a man. But it's possible. I just think it's really difficult.
And kind of as a follow-up to that, with the way that governments, looking at Nigeria, or I think it's Iran, their governments have been weaponizing basically internet access against their citizens.
think that like countries like the US or like tech companies in general have a like duty to kind of oppose that in the sense of like increasing access and usability to people in like those kinds of situations?
Yes, yes, yes. I think tech companies should have a moral stance and then, work on that moral stance and to wherever it's being violated, to enforce it. Right? So if it's blocking the internet, they should find ways to make it more free and more accessible. So I would welcome seeing tech companies doing that. The difficulty is that when governments like say, I'm trying to avoid names because I usually work with some of these governments, but the governments that we've seen in the news who have done this, they'll usually say, well, we're trying to limit misinformation, right? But then some of the disinformation came because Facebook's algorithms prioritize highly sensitive content that's most likely to be false. And so it's weird because now they're using the arguments, so now they're doing something that we know might be wrong, but they're justifying it because of what this tech, hybrid tech capitalism culture has created. And so the bigger we build these tech companies, we're actually also empowering those governments to then say, well, we're trying to have a good society without any misinformation. And so, yeah, so it's also like another side to that whole conversation.
But how can private companies infringe upon the sovereignty of countries? Because I think historically sovereignty has been this huge principle, right? Like even today in international relations, it's still very much respected, and like organizations like the UN only have so much power because of sovereignty. So how can private companies bypass that and kind of give individual people from these countries their quote unquote rights to kind of access this information?
Yeah. So I mean, the only obvious way that I know would be that is like building, say, VPNs, which is what you would use when the internet is shut down. And many people, I think even during the Hong Kong uprisings, right, they're using different VPNs, they're using different messaging software that works with Bluetooth and works with Wi-Fi, so it's not really necessarily online. So there are different, I guess, technical ways that tech companies might try to support the welfare of the citizens. But I mean, if the country is really determined, it makes it harder for the tech companies to encroach upon that sovereignty. I think of, for example, China being a useful example, right? They have like essentially their own internet, right? And then if you want to play in China, you have to follow the Chinese government's rules. And I don't think the tech companies are in a position to really say, we'll just make our own alternative thing, just because of the nature of the Chinese internet structure, how it's kind of walled off, and they have so much control. So it is hard to change this to affect the sovereignty of some nations. But in many of the other less developed countries, a simple VPN would probably do the job or something.
We might take the question from the chat as a last question. Do you think it could be possible and useful to create a common AI ethics conduct to rely on creating AIs? Question from Anna.
Okay. I'm not sure how to answer that question because I do think we can find universal shared values, but it's not apparent what exactly would serve as the basic minimum, because the same argument is made about human rights. The human rights framework is seen as like sort of like the basic minimum for what humans need, but basic minimum for who? In some countries, maybe having economic power or not being poor should be a right. I should have a right not to be poor. I should have a right to go to school for free, right? But then also, how do we even decide what is the basic minimum for human rights? Some of the people that I've worked with at the Carr Center, my friend Arati Krishnan, who sort of is trying to decolonize human rights space as well, she makes the same argument that human rights frameworks are just really the basic minimum, but they cover the worst cases, like say there's a genocide or something like that. But for the actual day-to-day experiences, we probably need to raise those. And some of you may have heard of the third wave of human rights, which a lot of African countries have been pushing since the 70s, which is the idea again that the basic human rights are not enough to cover what Africans actually need on a day-to-day basis. So to answer Anna's question, yeah, I think we can find, like a basic minimum, but it's gonna be hard to settle at what exactly is a basic minimum in such a way that it meets the needs of the people who need to be protected the most. So that's why I say, I don't know how to answer that problem.
What if the model wasn't international human rights law, but something like, biomedical principles? So just a set of
Do no harm and
yeah, like Hippocratic oath plus like the responsibility of researchers and physicians, and some of it is not just the bare minimum, some of it spells out very important responsibilities that can also come up in conflict, and we recognize that like decision making in that realm involves, deliberation, relation with the patients, and so on. And so it would set like constraints in a different way from like what you're, I see the problem of human rights.
yes, no, I think if there was such a case, I would happily agree to that. If we had a strong, robust framework that was the minimal, then I think that would actually be great. I'm just thinking of the very worst case. Say another sovereign state says, well, we don't agree, so we're not going to play along, right? And then, do you exclude them? Do you, how do you actually work with them? But to what you're saying, I totally agree. If we had a universal framework that was really strong and robust, I think that would be good.
All right, well, thank you for this really wonderful and provoking. Thank you everyone for coming. Don't forget your lunch.
If you're in Professor Delmas' contemporary political thought class, will you check in with me before you leave?
That's a lot of people.
I know. I just want to make sure I got it.
Great state, not church.
That was great, man. Do you have time to grab lunch?
Oh, no, is it? Yes. You know other ways?
I just like first time class.
No.
I'll just like meet you like walk together. Yeah.
That's a hike. You are right in terms that like you're kind of isolated out there a little bit. Especially if you're
I'm Sydney.
No, it's